make your blood run cold, and I'll try and hope that means that we'll get through to about to about 1 o'clock, so that we can then have about half an hour for questions from the audience, which Alan is going to be the ringmaster. Is the right term of that? Okay, so Michael, over to you.
Thank you. And just by way of preamble, so my 5 minutes haven't yet started, by the way. Just by way of preamble, you will see up on the screen that what we've done is a matrix, a grid for each of the parties, and a set of issues or questions which we thought were important to think about and address. And then each of us individually have given it a score as the extent to which we think the issue has been potentially dealt with in that manifesto. So where it is blank is where we feel that the issue hasn't even been raised at all in the manifesto, and then you get a score of from 1 to 5, where 5 is the highest score, 1 is the lowest score, and 3 is obviously an intermediate score, as to how each of us individually have ranked these things. This is just meant to be illustrative. You can, to the extent that you've looked at the manifestos yourself, be interested to see how you would score these things in comparison to us, and it might help to facilitate further discussion. So I'm meant to be talking about the Conservative manifesto, so now you can start my 5 minutes, Jim. What I want to do is, I'm not going to go through the details on that slide. What I want to do is to outline what I think are the 10 core trade-related issues which are raised in the manifesto, and I'll go through those fairly quickly. Now, in some sense, the Conservative approach to trade policy has probably received the most attention, so it's probably the most familiar, or maybe the most familiar to the audience here. So I want to quickly highlight the 10 things that I think are raised, just to sort of give a bit of information to those of you that haven't had a chance to read the 60-odd pages of the manifesto. And then I will raise what I consider to be 3 issues, and then hopefully stop. So, moving on rapidly, the 10 areas that are covered in the manifesto are obviously to leave the EU customs union and the single market. That's 1. 2, to negotiate a new free trade agreement with the EU by the end of 2020, and there will be no extension to the transition period, i.e. the promise is that this will be done by the end of 2020. 3, full control of fishing waters. 4, encourage the public sector to buy British. 5, no compromise on our high environmental and food standards. 6, full economic benefits of Brexit for Northern Ireland. Those 6 points are primarily to do with relations with the EU, I guess. The following 4 are a bit more broader. So 7 is a commitment, or not a commitment, that's not fair, it's an aspiration that 80% of UK trade will be covered by free trade agreements within 3 years. The NHS is not on the table in any form in these free trade agreement negotiations. The UK intends to lead the way in opening up trade and services, and there will be 10 free ports established. So those are the 10 broad areas, main areas that I think are covered in the manifesto, and you may want to pick up on any one of those in subsequent questions and discussion. What I want to do in my remaining 2.5 minutes is raise what I think are 3 issues. The first is the feasibility of signing a free trade agreement with the EU by the end of 2020, so within 11 or 12 months. My take on this is that it's extremely unlikely. It will be very, very difficult to do. Clearly, it depends on the extent to which the UK is going to be willing to accept the EU's position on this. All the noises are that the UK wants to move away in terms of things like regulatory policy, regulatory divergence, and so on. The more it wants to do that, the less likely it is that the EU is going to want to agree, because it's going to be worried about the so-called level playing field provisions, and therefore going to make it extremely unlikely. My prediction is that we'll be playing a game of chicken again throughout most of the next year, with the threat of no deal coming up towards the end of December 2020. Who's going to blink first? Well, experience tells us that it's almost certainly going to be the UK government that blinks. We're not going to get it done in time. There will be a small extension and some probably fairly shallow deal. That would be my prediction on that. Second issue I want to raise is the feasibility of signing FTAs with third countries and having 80% of trade covered within 3 years. That, I think, is for the birds. There's no way that is going to happen, is my view. Okay, even if you manage to sign a free trade agreement with the EU, that still leaves about 30% of trade to be covered. It's unlikely that a deal will be signed with China, so leave China out of it. If you take the top trading partners or exports for goods that the UK trades with, that means signing free trade deals with another 12 countries. That just isn't going to happen. Even signing a deal just with the US is going to be exceedingly challenging, as we've seen with regard to issues such as the NHS and so on over the last few weeks. So that's going to be exceedingly, technically it's possible, technically equally signing a free trade agreement with the EU, technically, legally it's possible, if there's the political will, but there just won't be the political will. We know that these free trade negotiations are inherently very complex. Final issue I want to raise is there's been a bit of brouhaha and sort of chatter amongst the press and so on about statement made by the Prime Minister over the weekend about by British state aid and government procurement and so on. One way of viewing that is oh my God, this is the Tory government becoming potentially much more protectionist by engaging in a much more active state aid policy. The flip side of that is the alternative argument is, well, hang on a sec, actually, the level of state aid in this country is pretty low, even under EU state aid rules. Current levels of state aid are about 0.4% of GDP. Some countries have as much as 2%. So we could, even under the existing EU rules, do a lot more state aid. And even a little bit more under the WTO agreement on government procurement. So under the existing rules, even if we agreed, the UK agreed to existing EU rules, we could do, there could be more state aid, and that could be all that was intended. But it might not be. It might be that there's an intention there to move beyond that, to go beyond the current EU state aid rules. That clearly would be highly problematic for signing an agreement with the EU, and might then be problematic for signing agreements with other countries. So it's possible that the whole government procurement issue has been overblown, but equally it's possible that it could be quite a big issue in the future. There I will stop.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Julia.
Thanks. So as Jim said, we'll be talking about the Labour Party's manifesto. And to just start by giving a very high-level summary of what the Labour Party's Brexit proposal is, it would be firstly that Labour would negotiate a new deal with the EU, which would have a much closer relationship with the EU than the Conservative deal that Michael has just talked about. And that would be negotiated within 3 months of taking office, the manifesto says. And then that deal will be put to the people in a legally binding referendum within 6 months, alongside an option to remain in the EU. And then the Labour Party would implement whatever choice the British public makes in that referendum. So then what's interesting is what would be in that deal that the Labour Party would negotiate. So firstly, Labour would seek a permanent and comprehensive UK-wide customs union with the EU. It would want close alignment with the single market. It would want dynamic alignment with the EU in areas like workers' rights, consumer rights, environmental protection, and also would want to see continued participation in EU programmes and agencies and security arrangements. So some of those things are clear and some of them are perhaps a bit more vague. So a customs union with the EU, a UK-EU customs union, would ensure tariff-free trade between the UK and the EU. But it would also mean that the UK would have to levy the same external tariff as the EU does. That means that the UK couldn't negotiate its own free trade agreements on tariffs on its own, and that it would be bound by any trade deals that the EU would make in terms of having to levy the same tariffs as the EU does. The manifesto talks about this and says that it would want joint UK-EU trade deals, although it's not entirely clear what that would mean. It might be possible for the UK and the EU to agree on some kind of consultation arrangements where the UK can have some input into EU trade negotiations, but it seems very unlikely that the UK would have a seat at the table in the EU's trade negotiations, or even some kind of veto rights. So having a customs union with the EU would certainly limit the UK's policy space in terms of what it can negotiate in its own free trade deals. And much of that is not really acknowledged so much in the manifesto. The second point, which is perhaps not left a little bit vague, is this close alignment with the single market. Now, the degree of alignment that means is quite important. It's important for the border in Northern Ireland, because if the alignment with the single market on goods is not complete, then that would have to be some special arrangements still for Northern Ireland. It's important also in the sense that it's not clear whether close alignment in the single market includes the single market for services. If it doesn't, then that would impact on UK services providers. It's another area which is a little bit ambiguous is Labour's commitments to freedom of movement of people, which is, again, of course, part of the single market. That is up for discussion in Labour's negotiation with the EU. Although there is a recognition to say that freedom of movement has brought lots of benefits to the UK, so it's left sort of open to perhaps a continuation or something very close to a continuation of freedom of movement. But it is still left slightly ambiguous. And the final point there is this dynamic alignment to EU standards, which essentially would mean that the UK would align with the EU, tracking EU rules as they are changed or updated, and making sure that the EU would uphold the EU standards at least at the same level as the EU. State aid is not specifically mentioned, although there is a commitment in the manifesto that level playing field protections would be maintained in any deal with the EU. So all of those things suggest that Labour are seeking a much closer relationship with the EU than the Conservatives, and that would impact on the space that is available for future trade deals with other countries around the world. It would be very much dependent on this close relationship with the EU. And the final point to make before handing over to Nico is just to say that all of this will be negotiated. This deal is supposed to be negotiated within 3 months. That's very ambitious. And this referendum is supposed to be held within 6 months, which again is quite ambitious considering all the preparations that are needed for a referendum. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Also very good.
Okay, the Brexit party. So this is a bit typical in terms of styles and objectives relative to the other parties. They don't have a manifesto. As I say, there's other parties fill them with lies, and so the manifesto became bad words. What they propose is a contract with the people. The objective is not to form a government. I actually want to get enough MPs, enough seats in Parliament to form a coalition with the Conservative Party and make sure that the Conservatives will deliver on Brexit. Boris Johnson made a lot of promises that Brexit would happen with a deal, without a deal, but then when it came down to the fact, it didn't happen, so they want to make sure that actually the Conservatives will deliver on Brexit. The main point of the policy is Brexit, and what they want is a clean break Brexit. What is this? This would imply no more waste of time, no more fiddling around with Michel Barnier, Brussels, and negotiations. There's no requirement of a withdrawal agreement. So the main objective will be to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. And that has to be done very soon. The objective is by summer 2020, so even before the Conservative Party. And if that wasn't likely to happen for the Conservatives at the end of 2020, that is even less likely to happen by the summer 2020. So a bit skeptical on the timing here. If the FTA is not available, if they cannot manage to sign a free trade agreement with the EU, then just exiting with no deal will be just fine. What kind of trade agreement are they looking for? It's not something like Norway, not something that will imply close alignment with the EU. They don't want to be subject to EU regulation and to the ECJ. Rather, they're looking for something like a Canada-style or a Japan-style free trade agreement, so liberal in goods and quite open in terms of services, although, as I think other research from the UKPO showed, this is not, on services, integration is not as close as the current access to the EU market. So that could be a problem for services. Now, the other trade policy that they want to adopt is to lower MFN tariffs with the rest of the world, especially in goods such as food, footwear and textiles. These are sectors that are currently quite restricted by the European Union. And the reason to lower this kind of tariffs is to lower consumer prices, essentially. And that's the real policy in terms of trade. Then, according to them, Brexit will yield a dividend of about £200 billion, and that would be used to invest in rural regions and not focus on London but on the rest of the countries, on things like roads and infrastructures and internet connections. So you could see these a bit as an investment on those left behind by international trade. The last point I want to cover is Northern Ireland. This has been a major issue in the negotiation both in May's government and the Boris Johnson government. For the Brexit Party, this is not a problem. Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic have different currencies, they have different tax system, and they've just been fine until now. So they don't really see a reason why exiting from the European Union would require a hard border. And this, I think, is a bit worrisome. The other thing is that if it is the EU that really wants to keep the Good Friday Agreement intact, well then it should be the European Union to make concessions and exceptions for Northern Ireland, and it's not something that we should care about. And I guess that's all for the Brexit Party. I leave it to the Lib Dem.
Okay, I'll head straight off then. I think we know what the Liberal Democrat policy on Brexit is. The policy is no Brexit. And at least so far as international trade with the European Union is concerned, the truth of the matter is that it actually doesn't get much better than that. That is not to say that everything is perfect within the European Union, but out of all the range of options that there are, we're not going to get a freer, less friction-ridden arrangement than that. So the result is we certainly have tariff-free, also more or less formality-free trade in goods. The single market handles most of the regulatory issues. There's a good deal of freedom of movement in terms of services. The OECD suggests that service barriers are a lot lower within the European Economic Area than between the economic area and outside. The Liberal Democrats make a big play of free movement. It crops up in several places in the manifesto. They make the argument that freedom of movement is essential to innovation. They also make the argument that it's essential to fisheries, I noticed. Provide sort of alignment on environment, labour, competition. Well, that's what the single market is. It is total alignment. And of course it does move us back to the status quo on Northern Ireland, where there are essentially no friction, other than worrying about currency. So that's trade with Europe. What does it imply for trade with the rest of the world? In a sense, the Liberal Democrats more or less excuse themselves from dealing with this, implicitly on the assumption that everything will be fine when we get back to the status quo. I take a slightly more what you say, constructive view of this, and ask, well, if you're in favour of the status quo, can we imagine ways in which the status quo could be improved? So on developing country access, Europe has got a fairly reasonable system for offering developing countries access, but a far from perfect one. The general system of preferences is only partial preferences, it's limited geographically. The economic partnership agreements with the with the ACP countries are really, most economists feel, pretty nightmarish in terms of their complexity and what they deliver. In terms of further tariff liberalisation, Europe isn't in the mood for reducing tariffs in general, so I think we can say, no, there's not going to be further tariff liberalisation if we keep full alignment. On free trade agreements, in a sense, you don't have to worry about new ones. There are 40 already. But it is the case that the EU is intending to be a lot more muscular about the enforcement of the conditions. One of the additions to the Trade Commissioner's armoury is going to be a chief enforcement officer who is going to tell FTA partners they've got to do what they promised in labour and environment and so on. The Liberal Democrats think that is absolutely fine. They are signed up to ensuring that no free trade agreements worsen labour or environment quality, they say, maintain and achieve very high standards. The Liberal Democrats are very explicit about favouring a rules-based system. They champion, they name things like the World Trade Organization and many other multilateral organizations. So, and the EU is also, for the WTO, probably the strongest advocate that the WTO has got at the moment. So that is an area where there is a great deal of sort of commitment. Finally, suitable consultation on trade policy. The Liberal Democrats don't mention anything about that, but my view is that in Britain we have very inadequate consultation anyway, and therefore the status quo actually does need to be improved. We've forgotten about trade policy in Britain for the last 40 years, and it really shows. And if we remain within the European Union, it actually would be healthy for us and healthy for the Union to have a broader conversation about trade beyond just the sectoral interests of the bankers looking after banking trade and the textile producers looking after textile trade. So my view is that it's a sort of missed trick so far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned. No, it's not there.
Okay, well, I'm left with the Greens, which are pretty well the Lib Dems in context of trade. There's no specific section on trade or trade policy, but no one else has apart from the Conservatives, I think, so you can perhaps be forgiven that. They have a number of sort of specific issues that they're interested in, one of which is increased transparency vis-a-vis EU trade policy. I mean, I think this is partly about the Commission, but it's also about the Council and how that works. And they're not interested in any agreements with investor state dispute settlement. So that's quite clear. The high scores that you will see there, and I'm sort of relieved to see that Alan's high scores are not very different from mine, just get driven by the assumption that we're going to remain. We're going to have a people's vote, and then we'll remain in that. And that carries a whole series of things off to make room for what is the principal aspect of the manifesto, which is the Green New Deal. And I'm not going to go through the New Deal in any way, but I just want to pick up, well, let me say one other thing before I move on to the New Deal. Free movement. They are really, really, really up for free movement. But not only no barriers at all for EU members, citizens, but also the same for citizens from third countries. And sort of very happy to hand out, I don't want to sound, it's quite a nice idea, but no work permits. I mean, work permits would be available for asylum seekers. And so on. So that is really quite a big issue, and in domestic policy, which they stand out on, I think, by any means. But the Green New Deal, it's quite interesting in the sense that when you look at the part of it dealing with industry, they come up with rhetoric that I haven't seen before, I have to say. If I'm just going to try and read it out from my phone, the Green New Deal will subsidies to help firms decarbonise, and farming will get subsidies to shift to more environmentally fair and functioning agricultural policy. And they want to bring in, they have an objective for Britain to again become a manufacturing powerhouse based on the new industries that will be created by the new Green Deal, the Green New Deal. And to bring back to the UK a manufacturing with the use of proactive, wide-scale support for manufacturing. And the key question about that is the one that's been raised by everyone on the way down, is how is this going to sit with any set of state aids rules, competition rules. It's not clear to me they're that interested in competition as a tool for environmental policy and so on. So it's very hard to see how this will run in tandem with an EU, a set of EU policies, both external and internal, that will make it difficult, depending on what Michael noted earlier on, that so far we've not used the leeway we have on the state aids. And we could probably ramble them up quite a lot, but that really needs quite careful with looking at them. Certainly, as I say, incoherent with any sort of EU trade policies as they stand at the moment. So, there we are, we stopped dead on 1 o'clock.
Okay.
Alan.
And so I'm going to moderate a conversation now